Yeah, yeah, you sound great, and we are live. We are live.
Amazing.
Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome to Unlearning Economics. Sorry for the slight mix-up there and a bit of a delay, but we're here now. So I have with me Michael Muthukrishna, who is Associate Professor of Economic Psychology at LSE. Michael is a former slash current colleague of mine. See if you can make sense of that. And he has released a book called A Theory of Everyone, who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. So, Michael, thanks so much for coming to chat to me.
Thank you for having me on the show, Kahal. I've been very excited about this.
Yeah, yeah, me too, me too. So, yeah, I mean, I read your book, obviously, and it's one thing that really struck me, and I'm never sure whether to say this to academics. If I say it's really well written, because in academia, if somebody says your paper's really well written, then what they
Yeah.
mean is like the substance of it is bad. But like, I think with a I find that people don't like that compliment. But with a book, I think it's super important. It's so readable for a theory of everyone. It's like a really accessible deep dive into a whole bunch of different disciplines. So that was something that I really valued about it. Um, but
I
what I wanted,
appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah, yeah, good. I'm glad you appreciate it. It's not. I've been told it's a death sentence in academia. That. Um, so I wanted to start actually by asking a little bit about you. Because
Oh,
one
sure.
thing
Yeah.
one thing that comes early on in the book, it's not the opening, but it does come early on, is the story of your life, and your life is actually pretty interesting. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that, and maybe how that structured your beliefs and why it inspired you to write the book.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I should tell readers, potential readers, I didn't initially have the section about me in the book because, when I do my work, I'm kind of divorced from it a little bit. But then my editor was like, people want to hear a little bit more about the person behind the writing.
Hmm.
So, and I think I wish I did more of it. So if anyone's thinking about writing a book, I highly recommend it. So I guess my personal story helps understand, the research that I do, but maybe in hindsight. So I study culture, and I'm interested in building better models of culture and a better basis for really the human and social sciences, for behavioral science. Something that's grounded in first principles, something that is formally and mathematically designed, and so on. And I didn't want to be an academic. That was never my goal. I just saw a lot of world problems in the world growing up that I felt like we need better tools to deal with these problems. So actually, in undergrad, I did engineering and I did a dual degree. And in my second degree, I ended up majoring in psychology. But I took everything from, economics, political science, philosophy, biology, set it on all kinds of things and took them. Um, and my first interest was, look, I'm going to do engineering on the side. I've been programming since I was a little kid. I'm sure this will be easy. What I'm going to do is I want to understand or tackle a big question. And this was great at the beginning, but eventually I realized, psychology is asking some of the most interesting and important questions out there. And they're doing, in my view, such a poor job of it from a theoretical perspective. And so I got really dissatisfied, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to work on smart home designs. I'm going to apply psychology to this. But what was motivating me behind the scenes was, I was born in Sri Lanka, and I left when I was 2 years old, but we used to visit quite regularly. So I was there during its 25-year civil war. I tell the story of, when during one of these visits, the central bank was bombed by the Tamil Tigers, and my grandmother was in the building, the MX office, right opposite, and so she was badly injured, and that was the first time I ever saw my father cry, just from the shock and trauma of it. But what was interesting to me is just how normal life was for people living there. It's like, oh, of course we have checkpoints, and of course bombs occasionally go off, but life was blasé. People
Hmm.
dropped their kids at school, they went grocery shopping, they had things with friends. And I actually grew up in Botswana, which was just north of South Africa, and I was there during the transition from apartheid. So from about 1990 to about 1997, apartheid ended in 1994. So I remember, this period where there was all this concern, before all this all happened. And then 94, Mandela gets voted in, and there's all of this hope and also concern and worry. It's like, what does the future of this country look like? Can South Africa make it? And if anybody's looked recently, South Africa is in quite a lot of trouble. There wasn't someone to maybe step into Mandela's shoes. Um, I promise I'm not seeking out like, dangerous situations, but I was also in Papua New Guinea, during a government coup. We lived 500 yards from Parliament House when people were, driving around with M16s and deposing the leader. I won't go into the details of that. Um, but I also lived in, I lived in Australia, I lived in Canada, I lived in the United States. I now live in the UK.
Mm,
So I witnessed all sides of humanity, if you like, a diversity of what
mm,
people are like. And what I realize is people don't really understand that diversity at a kind of deep level if you've only lived in one place. It's like speaking a single language.
mm.
English is words and words are English. So I wanted to get at that and get at that in a rich way.
It reminds me a bit of Forrest Gump, actually, a little bit when you talk about that. It's like whichever country you go to, it's like when he meets the world leaders, right? Just before they get assassinated. But not, I mean,
Exactly.
obviously, this has given you the context to write a book called A
Yeah.
Theory of Everyone, right? And to contrast the different
Right.
cultures and everything. And I mean, I rate the stuff about yourself. I think your editor or whoever was probably right. I'm actually writing a book at the moment, and I think it's good to open with it, but not dwell on it too much and get self-indulgent,
Right.
which I think you do greatly. So in terms of this contrast of different cultures, countries
Mm.
escaping apartheid, countries going through coups,
Yeah.
countries which are maybe a bit richer, a bit more politically stable, and then the
Yeah.
UK, whatever that is. You've seen a lot of different types of cultures, and one of the things that if you write a book called A Theory of Everyone that you have to navigate is this nature versus nurture type distinction, right? And
Yeah.
so you say, so let me quote you here because I really like the way you put this. You said the nature versus nurture debate for human behavior makes about as much sense as a right leg versus left leg debate for human walking. So could you explain how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah. So the reason, so the theory of everyone that I'm describing is a theory called dual inheritance theory, and that humans are a new kind of animal, different to other animals, in that our behavior is determined by our genes, as every animal is, and as well as kind of what we learn over our lifetime. But we have a second line of inheritance that we call culture. So, one analogy that I use is that it's kind of like hardware and software. So most animals are kind of pure hardware with a little bit of learning, whereas we have a lot of cognitive software that we acquire over that has accumulated over centuries and that guides the way that we think. And it's impossible to understand human behavior without considering both of those factors. So genes, culture, and I guess the lifetime of learning, right? And that's what I mean by the left leg or like right leg. So you might know, just to deal with a few facts, you might know that intelligence is about 50% heritable,
Mm,
right? And it varies, right? It's as little as 10, to 30%. On some measures, it's up as high as 80%. It is sometimes varies by SES. So, for example, in the United States, heritability seems like it's higher among wealthy Americans than it is among lower Americans. Now, the problem is that, first off, people misunderstand what that stat is actually saying, like what heritability is.
mm,
And I think what people think about when they hear heritability is inheritance. It's like if you say, something is 50% heritable, it means like, it's kind of 50% from my parents and then 50% from,
mm,
somewhere else. But that's actually not what it means at all. What it means is the degree to which I can predict the variation in the phenotype, so height or intelligence or whatever, educational attainment, based on the variation in the genotype. So how much the genes are varying and how well that can predict it in a regression. Now, the trouble is that that is going to depend on the variability of the cultural input, right? So if you imagine a world, so here's something for you. You know this from the book, right? But what is the heritability of number of fingers?
mm.
You know, Unfortunately, we can't get listeners' feedback, but if
Yeah.
you think of heritability as inheritance, you're going to think it's close to 100%. In fact, it's close to 0%. And the reason for that is this very little phenotypic variance. Almost all of us have 10 fingers. There's a little bit of genetic variance because you have polydactylism that gives you more fingers. And you have some cultural variance because people lose fingers, and that's actually much more common. So the genes don't have a lot to predict anyway, and there's not a lot of genetic variation. So heritability is close to 0%. Now, in an environment that is incredibly, like perfectly culturally homogenous. Everybody goes to the same kinds of schools, same kind of parental investment, same wealth, same cultural input, reading the same books, watching the same media, whatever. the heritability of intelligence and the heritability of educational attainment would be close to 100% because the only thing left to vary is random noise and genes, right? Um, so yeah, that's basically what's going on with heritability. So if we look across the history, if we look across the kind of cultural fossil record, and we think about human cognition and human abilities, a lot of what we think of as just human is not human. They are delivered to us by our education systems that have accumulated culture. So here's an example: numeracy, right?
Mm,
You can count. I can count. Many of us can count. Most humans, for most of history, counted like this: one, two, three, many. And to overcome that, we had to use things like fingers or stones.
mm,
But even once we got there, it took centuries before we got the concept of zero because zero stones or zero fingers is nothing, right? There's nothing to represent there. And this emerges in South Asia and then kind of spreads through Arabia into the Middle East. But even then, negative numbers are even more difficult to understand. I
mm.
have a quote from Francis Mazury's a British Canadian mathematician who says, negative numbers darken the very fabric of reality. Today we can all count. Or another example is logical reasoning. You might think humans are logical. Alexander Luria, Russian psychologist, goes out 1920s to Uzbekistan, and he asks people without education, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zemlya, it snows, what color are the bears there? People with education, white. You, white. My 6-year-old, white. People without education, I don't know. Seen a brown bear, maybe brown, maybe black. So yeah, so my point is that all of this, all of our behavior, our cognition, the way we think, how we literally see the world in terms of visual illusions are a
Mm.
factor, are a combination of our genes and our culture. It's like walking. It's like walking. You can't consider without both.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good answer. I mean, you highlighted the Russia story. I actually, one thing I really liked was, I think in the context of IQ tests, you were talking about the chat with a guy called Rakhmat from Namibia, was it? About abstract
So that was
reasoning.
from Luria, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Uzbekistan.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Sorry. He was from Uzbekistan. Yeah, but it just, because these people just grow up in a world of practicality. If you ask them a really
yeah,
abstract question, like was it, which one is the odd one out of
mm,
tools and a saw and a hammer and a
yeah,
marshmallow or whatever, they don't really answer in the way that we would expect. They don't do the abstract reasoning. They just like try to think about a practical situation that you could put those things into,
exactly,
and so that
exactly.
yeah, they'll fail. They'll get low scores on on a Western IQ test, right? But that doesn't mean they're stupid. That's just how culturally contingent the test is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, culture is like the water we swim in, right? You don't see it until it disappears or it changes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so this debate is obviously very, very contentious, and the issues like race, gender, maybe sexuality, transsexuality, and things like that. They all come up in this debate. So you kind of, you're navigating this, right, because you want to be um, honest about the facts,
Right.
but also sensitive, and also not take the facts too far. So there's a whole section about men and women, right? And I think I'm fair in saying most of the section is saying that in terms of personality, aptitudes, and traits, men and women are pretty similar, right? But there is this little part about some of the differences between them. And so I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could speak to not only maybe some of the differences that you see between them in the research, but also maybe what this implies. Is it just true, but it doesn't really imply much about society because we can choose to change things,
Yeah.
or do you think that there are concrete implications for how we manage society and our economies, for example?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that I was careful in the sense that, I try to capture as much of the nuance as one can do in a popular book.
Mm,
But I really took the gloves off in the sense, like, I really did my best to faithfully convey the latest theory in science, right? Even when it was kind of uncomfortable to do so. And I do that for like race and IQ. I talk about, genetic differences. I talk about all this kind of stuff. And you pointed at one of the sections that was challenging, which is sex differences
mm,
in a variety of outcomes. So, on my reading of this literature, we are a sexually dimorphic species, which means that there are differences between, like, notable, measurable, easily measurable differences between males and females. Take something like height, for example, right? With a sample size of about 50 males and 50 females, you can reliably, statistically significantly tell that males are taller on average, which suggests there was intermale competition. When it comes to cognition, um, there isn't clear evidence that there's any mean difference in male and female performance, right? Um, there just doesn't seem to be any. There might be on some of the subtests, but it's not reliable. It's not clear. Where there, I think, is a stronger case to be made is that there is a variance difference between males and females, right? And we see this even for, like, so take something like physical traits. There is a mean difference in speed, of runners. There's a mean difference in strength. But there's also a variance difference in that the male distribution has a bigger spread. It's more widely spread, right? So as a result, so there's a couple of things to note here. The first is that normal distributions are exponential functions. Now, exponential functions means that when you move away from the mean, things go like crazy high. So when you're at the tails, insofar as the tails are representative, and they might not be, there's a little bit of contention around that, but insofar is that true, the difference you see at the mean is going to be very different to the difference of the tail. So if we look at, let's deal with something that's a little bit less contentious. Look at sports ability, like speed or something like that. At the mean, if you look at, let's say, a high school sports star, there is going to be a difference between males and females on that just because of the mean difference. But it's not going to be as large as the difference you find among elite athletes.
Mm.
That difference is going to be much larger because it's at the tails of this exponential distribution. Now, if you look at something like IQ or cognitive ability, there is no mean difference as far as we can tell, but because there's a variance difference, what you're going to find is that males are overrepresented at both ends of the extreme. So they're going to be overrepresented in the poorest paying jobs. They're going to be represented in the lowest IQ. Like, I think it's 3 out of 4 children with mental disabilities are male. And so if you want to say that this distribution is even, right, and the mean is the same, then we should also see a compensation on the other end among males, which means that you would just, without any kind of discrimination or whatever, you might, if this is true, you might see a mean difference in the most competitive areas. So when a population is large, when there's a lot of people going, you might see a larger proportion of males than females for purely statistical reasons. Now, that doesn't mean we have to accept the world in that way. It just means that even if all the barriers were removed, if this sexual dimorphism actually is true, which, as I said, and I go into the book, there are some reasons why it might not be true, but insofar as it is true, then the removal of all barriers might not mean that you'll see an equal outcome in the final trait.
Mm.
And we know that there's all kinds of other, so what that means is you can't judge if a society is fair per se by the final outcomes. You can only judge if it's fair based on what are the barriers, identify them and remove them. And I think, so I point to some of the work, for example, on child penalties. So even without all of this, the mere fact that that women not only have an obligatory childbearing period in the sense, like, they're gestating and they take some time off then, but also because in most societies, women carry the largest proportion of childcare, there's a cost to their careers as a result of that. Now, what we also know is that varies cross-culturally. So in societies that do not provide support for families, childcare, and also just like a normative environment where males are involved in child rearing, then that gap is larger. And the gap closes and gets smaller. It doesn't fully close, but it's much smaller in societies where males are much more involved in the child rearing, where there's a lot more institutional support for women entering back into careers. I'm not, I don't want to say like one of these is better or worse, but I just want to look at the data because from my perspective, you can't solve a problem unless you first really understand it. You take the blinkers off, you take the biases off, you take off the things you want the world to be, and you really understand it. And then you can decide on your goals, what you want to achieve, where the barriers are, and wiggle your switches to get there.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose one of the questions is whether, if you think that we have set up economically, for example, where there's a certain type of job that gets rewarded, for instance, coding, and that kind of correlates quite well with IQ tests, which, as we've discussed, are kind of culturally contingent. And I think coding is probably a good proxy for what IQ measures, to be honest, an ability to code, right? I suppose the question is whether you see more men at the very top because of the higher variance, whether this is just both a true fact, but also contingent on the fact that our tech sector has grown a lot and has become much better remunerated, and that type of sector, as in one that seems to favor people with high IQs as measured by Western tests, and where males are overrepresented, that system seems to favor them. So in that sense, the sort of the resultant income distribution of that comes from the IQ is based on a mechanism that's contingent. I hope I made sense there. Do you do you agree?
I think that's right. So I think that, first off, I don't think that these are like arbitrary, right? So it's not like the tech sector's grown because of some conspiracy or something. The tech sector is providing value to a large number of people, and because of the value that's being created, those in that sector are being compensated for that. And insofar as those abilities are, males are actually there's more males who are worse at it, and there might be more males insofar as there isn't a main difference, and there might be more males that are, and so some males are benefiting from it and other males are absolutely not benefiting from it and are losing out because of this emphasis on the tech sector, right, as one example. But one thing to note, of course, is that I don't think that these things are arbitrary. Like, I don't think that the tech sector grew. I think it's providing value, but what is providing value also shifts over time. So if imagine a world in which actually the technology is now far more accessible because of, let's say, AI, right? Then the value, where value is created, might not be in the coding. It might be in the ideas. It might be in the collaboration. It might be in the networking. It might be in these other skills that are absolutely not captured by the IQ tests. So IQ tests are predictive of school and work performance in weird societies, so Western educated, rich and industrialized societies, because they're measuring the things that we consider to be valuable. But those things are changing just because of new technologies. So even during our lifetime, right, we saw once upon a time, right, it was valuable to memorize a lot of things. And now, with a little black box in my pocket, I have the world's knowledge at my fingertips, and memorization isn't as valuable as it once was. Or, when I was in middle school, my math teacher was like, you better get good at mental math because you're not going to carry a calculator in your pocket. I do carry a calculator in my pocket. It's less valuable to be able to store that in your head.
I remember them saying that, yeah.
Like they didn't foresee the rise of the iPhone, right? And so now when, especially like if AI fulfills its promises and, the age of the idea person arrives, right? And I think interpersonal skills, learning how to work with these AI, learning how to work with other people, those might become more valuable. And then our IQ tests are going to become less predictive of success because they're no longer picking up on the things that were previously considered to be the highest cognitive things.
Yeah, I see that. I suppose the question is, right, so with like the history of the tech sector, and for people watching, in case you're not aware of this, like you may have seen the film Hidden Figures. Everyone was that's about I think 3 African American women working on the moon launch, and who are, as the name suggests, quite hidden. In the UK, we had quite a burgeoning tech sector in the past, and it had loads of women in it. It was predominantly women, and then the government sort of sabotaged it, which is it's a kind of if you don't laugh, you'll cry moment. But I'm just wondering if there's this. It's if women are more dominant in a sector at a given time, and especially non-white women, is that sector rewarded less? Is there a bias there that sort of goes above the level of just sort of IQ or whatever? It's just like something that's a bit more social. And is it just the case that as men have shifted into the tech sector, it's become more prestigious, and maybe the value added, while obviously
Yeah,
very real, is a
yeah,
bit biased, because we think
yeah,
that things that
yeah.
men do are better, basically, to put it glibly.
Yeah. So I mean, I've heard this hypothesis before, but I don't suspect that that's what's going on. So I mean, it's true that like a computer used to be a job description. The hidden figures were computers, but it wasn't considered to be the most important or the hard
Mm.
work, right? Like the hard work was figuring out the overall designs, and then someone can compute it in the same way that building the model is fine, but the computer can calculate it for you. What I suspect is actually going on here is that men, because men are competing. There's a Jerry Seinfeld like skit where he says men will do the craziest things. They're climbing mountains. They're engaging in the most dangerous activities. They're just trying to get laid. Like they're competing with other males to get there. And so males are. I suspect what's happening is when a particular occupation or when a particular uh, set of skills provides large value and is thereby compensated, men rush into that industry, and that's what's actually happening causally. And so it looks like the industry where males go, they just get paid better, but I don't think that that's what's happening. I think it's quite the opposite. It's that
Hmm.
it's that males are rushing into these competitive industries because there's a bigger emphasis on this. I mean,
Mm.
the evidence seems to be that males overall are more competitive. We see some cross-cultural differences in this. So, among the Maasai, for example, very, very patriarchal society, males are very, very competitive relative to females. Among the Khasi, a matrilineal society in India, um, females, if anything, are a little bit more competitive than our males. Um, yeah, I mean, even overconfidence, so I have some data on overconfidence where it's not the case that males are universally more overconfident in the sense of they have higher confidence than is warranted by their actual performance. But males seem very confident in their confidence, what's sometimes called over precision. So whether males think that they're good or bad, they're just super confident about that belief.
Mm.
Whereas, women seem to be more risk averse around whatever it is they believe. And I think that results in a failure of action. And if that's true, there's a different mechanism we need in order to try to reduce that gap.
I suppose if there are different cultures, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the one you said that was matrilineal, where women are slightly more
Yeah, Likasi,
competitive.
yeah.
Yeah, Alakasi. So I was just wondering, what you think of efforts, and I'm going to be vague here because I can't think of any off the top of my head, but to change those attitudes. For example,
Yeah.
I mean, one example is like. I mean, one example is just the prevailing culture. Actually, there's a paper which you may be familiar with, on the I think looking at children, boys and girls in different US states, and whether those states have a sort of certain cultural background, whether they lean more towards like Democrats or Republicans. And it finds that if you grow up in a more sort of democratic state, then generally speaking, women are more likely to work. They're more likely to they're less likely to sort of just be stay at home or raise children alone, and also the men are kind of the reverse, right? They're more
Yeah.
likely to be that versus the Republican states. So these kind of background
Yeah.
attitudes, are
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
something that's worth trying to change and shift in a way that could, I
Yeah,
don't know, lead to more
absolutely.
equality?
No, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the big messages of the book is that if a lot of what makes us human is in our software, that software we know through history can be written in other ways.
Hmm.
It is, and we can see it in the cross-cultural data, right? Like as I mentioned, the Kasi versus the Maasai. This software is amenable. Like you and I every single person alive today was born into a world that they did not create. We just accepted it and we ran with it. We were told we had to go to school, we had to go to university, we had to work for this thing called money. We had to then use that money to do things in a certain way. We just accepted that world. And if the changes that we are capable of, or the world that we could create, is
Hmm.
limited by our imagination and path dependence. So
Hmm.
as I say in the book, the difference between utopia and an actually better world is an acceptance of the constraints of where we are and where we could go from where we are.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of things we could change, the modern world order, or the economic system, and so on. Now, what is also true, so we should definitely be trying different things. And we can see that the role the culture plays. So not only is it the case that you see this difference between Democrat and Republican states, but if you look at, for example, people's ancestry, societies that practiced plow agriculture tended to have a bigger male-female difference because a plow, even when driven by an ox, requires a lot of strength, and so males have a natural advantage. Now, societies that practiced hoe agriculture were done by males and females and are much more gender equal.
Mm.
But what's interesting is present day societies, those present day societies, with their ancestors were either plow or hoe based, have similar and gender attitudes that match being gender unequal in a plow-based society and more gender equal in a hoe-based society. And the descendants of those who arrive in the United States, that's where the data is from, but I'm sure this applies elsewhere, are also less likely to, be participate in the labor force if they're females, if they come from a plow-based society, and they have more gender unequal attitudes. So it's all open.
Mm.
The only caveat to this is that, as I talk about in the book, these different systems, these cultural traits are in competition with one another. And it's very difficult to know in advance, in a kind of God's eye view, which of those will actually win the competition. So it could be like there's no reason not to push for efforts toward greater gender equality. But how you do it can affect your competitiveness compared to a society that does it a different way, or a society that doesn't even bother to try to achieve gender equality.
Mm.
In the economic competition, in that social competition, in the competition of different traits, a society that sacrifices meritocracy to get there, for example, might be outcompeted by a society that doesn't choose to do that, that arrives there in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the only thing I would say. Yes, we should definitely be pushing, and it is very possible. You can put it in the most um, you can add incentives and policies to really push a system in any direction you want, but you can get reactance, and it'll come with other costs.
Mm. Mm. So you hinted at this. So I want to ask you about this, one of the central ideas, because there are a few big ideas, and I think one of them is the nature versus nurture debate that we've discussed. But the other one is the idea of the collective brain, right? So
Yeah.
you're very keen on the idea that, and I guess this relates back to IQ tests as well, that really our intelligence, our human intelligence, is actually a collective thing. It's not necessarily an individual thing. So could you explain that?
Yeah, so one of the things so humans reached a point where the amount of knowledge that we had to deal with was more than we could store in our brains. And so we divided up the labor. We divided up the information. Each of us became a specialist on one thing and pretty much stupid at everything else, right? If society collapsed and suddenly, I had to engage in agriculture, I'm screwed, man.
Yep,
Like,
I'd be dead
you know,
within a
like,
day.
like it's over, like I can't grow my vegetables. It's not going to work. I can't. And so we became stupid at a bunch of things. What we effectively did was we moved the computation to the population level, where you could better think of innovations not as being like geniuses among us who are kind of sitting there and and putting the pieces together in their own minds, but ideas flowing through a network and combining in people's heads. And as a result of that combination, new things are born, right? So like Newton, he's a bright guy. Leibniz is also a bright guy, and they both come up with calculus at roughly the same time. That's interesting, right? For the longest time in history, there's no calculus, and then two people come up with it at the same time. What are the odds? Or, Darwin, right? He comes up with a theory of evolution, but so does Wallace
Hmm.
at the same time. And in that case, we know how they came up with it, right? So they both read Thomas Malthus, it's the Malthusian trap, the fact that, so they were both breeders, and so they knew that artificial selection was possible. And when they read Malthus, they realized that nature could do some selecting. The genius in natural selection is not in the selection, it's in the nature. It's in the natural. So nature could do the selection. They'd read vestiges of the natural history of creation that animals could change over time. And they had both visited these diverse island archipelago where they saw firsthand the slight differences between the different species of birds, for example, on the different islands, showing that evolution could apply and they could become adapted. So that these ideas were recombined in these individuals' heads and something new was born. So what that also means is, and there's so much evidence for this. Like, I tell the story of Tasmania, cut off from the rest of Australia, where the people began to lose technologies. They lost the ability to make fire, fishing hooks,
Hmm.
boats. They would rub fat on their bodies and kind of push rafts through the water. So not only did they have a smaller technological toolkit than their cousins in the mainland, but even than their own ancestors. And that wasn't a genetic change, right?
Hmm.
It was a shift caused by a population shrinkage. If you were to suddenly drop half the population, we would lose so much knowledge because what's actually humanity is innovating, not humans per se, even though when we look at it, it seems like that. It seems like it's humans, but it's actually humanity.
Mm.
Like
Yeah,
we are part of a collective brain. Yeah.
the vision of the tortured lone genius is really really prevalent, I think, isn't it? And while it may be true on a kind of psychological level, it does just seem that, I mean, even Newton said, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And it
Yeah.
just seems that a lot of modern science and academia,
Yeah.
for all its faults,
Yeah.
is, and it has become more individualistic academia, but it's still largely a collective enterprise, right? You've got the process of
Absolutely.
peer
Yeah.
review, you've got going to seminars
Yeah.
and having feedback and citing the literature
Yeah.
and building on the literature,
Yeah.
right? You only really can create knowledge, I think collectively.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, as I say in the book and some of my papers, like an innovation requires an innovator no more than a thought requires a particular neuron. Like there is an innovator involved, but it could have been a different innovator just because the ideas were flowing through the network. And it could have been a different neuron that had that thought, even if you just replaced it. And that's why we see this kind of simultaneous inventions. We have a desire to
Mm.
find an innovator for psychological reasons because we want to know who to learn from. But it's a kind of illusion, actually. What's going on is these ideas are flowing through, and then individuals can embody a bunch of ideas. So, for example, this book is me writing it. I wrote the book, right? But I'm embodying ideas that I've received or sought out, or I'm engaging in things that I call like intellectual arbitrage. I'm actively seeking ideas from elsewhere and recombining them in new ways because I understand how the innovation process works, and so I'm actively using it. I help companies do the same thing. You have to think about it as a kind of population level process, basically.
Well,
Can I say one more? Can I
sure,
say
of
one more thing,
course.
Cathal? I really like, so the scientific process is a great example. So when we think of the scientific process, we think of experiments like A/B tests or something, right? Treatment and control. Science doesn't move forward because scientists, like you and I know this for a fact, we are not like better than the average person at going, oh, I now see the evidence. Scientists don't do that. Science works because we have a common understanding of what the
You
truth
got
is.
you
We
cut
have a common
out for a
understanding of what.
second there, by the way, Michael.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I
Can you hear
think you
me?
just cut out. It was as you were putting your hands on your hips and going, "Ooh, we are better at something about scientists
So,
being better." I think
so
you just cut out there for a bit. Sorry.
sorry. Quite the opposite. So what I said is that, science doesn't move forward because scientists are somehow better than other people who go, I've now seen the error of my ways in light of this new evidence. No, scientists like defend their theories to the death, right? Science works
Mm.
because we have a common basis for understanding what evidence and theory are, and we are incentivized to show each other that we're wrong. And so in this kind of collective enterprise, other people are watching as, you and I might debate over something and deciding who to learn from and who to copy. And so that's the filtering process that leads to new innovations, not like individual scientists running these A/B, treatment control RCT types experiments and figuring out the world.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think this leads nicely to how interdisciplinary your book is. I think because I think it's both an unconscious and a conscious attempt to be interdisciplinary. So I was just wondering, what's your collective brain? You hinted at it then. What are some of the specific traditions you'd say have influenced you the most? And I don't just mean
Yeah,
like biology, economics. I mean like subfields and things like that.
sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that I actually hate the term interdisciplinary because, it implies first off, it implies disciplines and it implies like you're trying to be interdisciplinary or something. The term I prefer is like non-disciplinary or, undisciplined. Like I'm an
Okay.
undisciplined scientist in the sense that, I'm partially joking, Kahal, but like, the point
Hmm.
is that I have questions I want to answer. I want to know how to create a successful, innovative, harmonious, and fair society. And I don't care
Mhm.
where the answers come from. They could come from psychology, from behavioral science, from economics, from political science, from philosophy, from cross-cultural. I don't care. I have a problem that I want to solve, and I have specific sub-problems to solve. And I will tackle them any way I can with any tools and any data that's available to me. Um, but you asked me, like what's kind of influenced me. I mean, I think I've had a few accidental influences that I think have shaped how I see the world. One of those was training as an engineer. So, one of the things I didn't really clock onto until I met my advisor, Joe Henrik, who's also trained as an aerospace engineer, in fact, is that engineers are taught to think about the world differently to scientists. So, scientists learn to study really in depth one small part of the world and understand that one thing really, really well to the absence of everything else. An engineer cannot do that. An engineer has to be able to zoom in and out of a system. They have to understand their small part of the system, but they have to understand how that small part connects to everything else. So you're forced and trained to being able to kind of see both the big picture and the particular tree or the particular machine, the particular bit of code or whatever you're working on. So that, what's called encapsulation or object oriented, in design, is something that I think about when I work on a system. Like I think of the human machine or the societal machine in a similar way, although it's a little bit, it's obviously complex and chaotic. The second thing is, I was exposed when I was working on smart home technologies, I was exposed to control theory, which is the math of feedback loops. So this was actually, as I explained in the book, this was actually what got me thinking, actually, it is possible maybe to build a science of culture. Because feedback loops, so your thermostat is an example of this, it checks the temperature and it adjusts the heating or the cooling to adjust to maintain that temperature. Those feedback loops and the way you think about what happens when you have a lag on that learning or a delay,
Mm.
so if you're in a hotel that you haven't been in and the water, there's a delay or a lag on your action and the water coming down, you're going to oscillate, right? Or if there's, take something like climate change. One of the reasons that there's many reasons that climate change is difficult to solve, and one of them is that our actions is a massive delay on when they affect the world. And so causally, it's almost impossible for us to learn it with any of our three learning systems. You can't learn it over a lifetime. It's very difficult to learn culturally, and it's difficult to learn genetically. I hope we don't learn it genetically because it means we're going extinct. Um, so as a result, there are these kinds of ways of thinking about the world, I would say. And there's more. I don't know. You don't want to spend the rest of the episode on that.
No, no, it's really interesting. Obviously, you've got like such an interdisciplinary background. I suppose I kind of like the idea of what did you say, undisciplinary or
Yeah,
undisciplined? Was
undisciplined.
it? Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I quite like that idea and kind of this engineering idea of like object focused, like what am I
Yeah,
studying, and then I can use whichever tools are the best I mean, in a way, when you say it out loud, it seems kind of obvious, and you're
yeah,
wondering why would anyone not do that. But I mean, coming from economics, right? We don't really do object focused. We do method. We're very method focused. It's like how can I
yeah.
tweak this model so that it can accommodate this, or how can I
Right,
run a regression on this thing, right? Basically,
right, right,
so
right,
it's
right,
like
right,
it is a different way of doing things, and I think psychologists
right.
can be quite method focused as well, to be honest. So
Yeah,
yeah. One other thing to segue again a little bit, because I haven't asked you
yeah.
about this yet, and it arguably is actually the most important thing in your book, energy, right?
Right,
Your theory of everyone, you could argue, is actually a theory of energy, and how human society
right.
has changed maps quite closely, in your view, onto energy.
Yeah,
And you talk about the energy ceiling, the energy return on input, right? And energy return on
right.
investment, sorry. And so why is this energy so important? How does it explain major sort of economic and cultural evolutions?
Yeah, right. So, it's a good example, I think, of studying a system in isolation without thinking about the bigger picture, right? So, quite often economic models they're like perpetual motion machines. They're loops. There's an economy is a circular loop between like firms and households and firms and households, and around we go, right? Um, no system works that way. You have to have some input into the system. But that's actually not where I came from. So one of the biggest sections of my research is on cooperation. So how is it that we could cooperate at the scale that we do of nations of diverse peoples numbering in the hundreds of millions, if not a billion? That you and I take that for granted, the fact that you and I can sit down in a room together, but it's freaking weird. right? From a cross-cultural, a cross-species perspective, like if we were two
Mm.
chimps who didn't know each other, and you put us in a room together, that's two dead or maimed chimps with blood strewn everywhere, right? But we do this every day. Like I'm gonna hop on the tube to go home, and it'll be unremarkable that I'm in a tube with a bunch of strangers. And it's even strange from a historical perspective, right? Like we're from different places around the world. We might have been former enemies, right? Like we didn't get on necessarily with strangers. And it's still unusual from a geographic perspective because some societies have poorly functioning governments, and it would be incredibly unsafe to just put a bunch of strangers together. And others, Australia's fine. Afghanistan, not so much. The Democratic Republic of Congo. So I'm working on this problem of cooperation. And in 2005, Science Magazine actually lists this problem as one of the top 25 for the coming quarter century. And a lot of the focus was on identifying mechanisms that can sustain cooperation. Inclusive fitness or kin selection explains why we cooperate with family. Um, uh, Direct reciprocity, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth,
Mm.
explains why we cooperate with friends and people we regularly interact with, your office mates, for example. Indirect reciprocity or reputation combined with norms explains how we cooperate with people we know of. Religion has been used to explain a kind of superordinate cooperation among beyond kind of ethnicity, binding people together in these large religious units. And of course, institutions do an excellent job of ensuring cooperation when they work. Governments, police forces, judiciaries, and so on. Like I don't really go after criminals myself. I pay my taxes and hope to hell that the government does that for me.
Mm.
So I was working on this, and then one of the things I realized as I was working through this literature and doing some experiments here is like, hang on a second, hang on a second. These mechanisms don't explain the rise of cooperation. They all exist at the same time. In fact, what we call corruption is really one scale of cooperation undermining another. When a president or prime minister gives his son a contract, that's nepotism, but it's also inclusive fitness or kin selection, undermining our institutions. When a manager gives her friend or a friend of a friend a job, that's nepotism, but it's also direct or indirect reciprocity, undermining our meritocracy. So if these lower scales of cooperation exist at the same time, then how did we get to a higher scale? How did that happen? So I started to read, I was like, if we're cooperating, we have to be cooperating for something. There has to be a shift. And when we write down our models, this is probably more than listeners want to know, but when we write down our models, we write them down as dilemmas, right? Like a dilemma where it's what is good for me is going to be higher than what is good for the group. It's not interesting otherwise. The Nash equilibrium is going to be the group. Who cares? In reality, that's not how we cooperate. What we cooperate is, do I cooperate with me by myself or my family or my friends or my company or the region or the country or and onward and upward. You always have these options to cooperate. So what are people cooperating for and how? And how? So, as I said, I took biology. And so I realized we had something called energy budgets. And we see that what animals are really engaging in, what life really is matter using energy to make more of itself, to capture other matter. This some people have considered this a mistake. I don't know. I tried to do it as quickly as possible. I wanted to show how fundamental this rule is by starting with the beginning of life and showing how initially you had energy only from vents and the sun and gravitational energy of a moon that was closer to us, creating big tides. And then eventually you get photosynthesis, which you're converting the energy from the sun into sugar, right? Into chemical form, ATP. And then some animals go, hang on a second, I don't want to do this slow thing of converting the sun's energy and moving at plant pace. I'm going to eat another animal. I'm going to capture that little stored energy that they have and use it to make more of myself. Zoom into what the human story is. If you look at a graph of progress, of any metric of progress you might care about, child survival rates, longevity, health, size of polities, GDP per capita, whatever, it's flat right up until the Industrial Revolution. So, the Black Death, the Scientific Revolution, the Renaissance, the fall of the Roman Empire, these are blips on any of these metrics until we get to the Industrial Revolution. And then everything just hockey sticks up into nothing. And people attribute this to technology. The technology was there. What happened was that we found millions of years worth of stored sunlight in the ground. Those earlier life forms that I mentioned, right? Algae and zooplankton. And so peat turned to black rock was coal, cheap and available and easily accessible in this country. Algae and zooplankton turned to oil and natural gas. These were millions of years worth of stored batteries, if you like. And energy is the multiplier on the effort of all life, including ourselves, right? The more energy you have, like think about traveling across the globe by foot or by with a horse or by a car or by an airplane, right? Think about building an IKEA bookshelf with a manual screwdriver or an electric screwdriver. Energy is the multiplier in human ingenuity and human effort. And when we could access this, suddenly it blasted everything off into space. Now, the thing is, initially, energy was highly accessible to us to the point where if you look at the regressions, it doesn't matter anymore because it's so accessible. And so economics as a discipline, which emerged so long after the Industrial Revolution, was focused on efficiency because what you wanted to do, what the field wanted to do was to get more with less. And that was where growth was, in getting more with less, efficiency gains. But there's a limit to efficiency, right? Like there's a limit, like at the end of the day, a certain number of joules or watts is needed to heat a building. You can do it more efficiently, you can, insulate it, you can do all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, a certain number of joules or watts is needed. So what I call the space of the possible is, if you like, the energy ceiling, which has been high for so long, and an efficiency floor. And most of our gains in quality of life were driven by these greater efficiencies in technologies and what we could do with all of that energy. But now we have two problems. One is the efficiency floor is the rate at which it's changing is shrinking, like total factor productivity that is slowing down. And second, the energy ceiling is coming down on us. So, I point to a stat on energy return on investment. So this is the amount of energy it takes to get some amount of energy back. It's a measure of excess energy, and excess energy is fundamentally what creates wealth. And if you look at even just something like oil discovery rates, in 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100. And by 2010, 1 barrel of oil found you another 5. Now, energy is still plentiful, just don't get me wrong, right? But because of the slowdown, it's triggering our zero-sum biases, which is resulting in polarization. It's resulting in fracturing of societies. It's resulting in the rise of the right wing, right? It's resulting in a rise in right-wing ideologies that we haven't seen in Europe in a century, right? But all of this is a function of that zero-sum biases being triggered. That my level of cooperation is shrinking because here's the law of cooperation, as I call it in the book. The law of cooperation is that the optimal scale of cooperation is the one at which I can reliably get a reward when divided up by the number of cooperators that will be larger than what I would get in either a smaller or a larger group. The optimal size of a scientific collaboration is the one where my reward, like if I was a physicist, I would love to write papers by myself, but I need to work with thousands of others and a large Hadron Collider. If I'm an economist, I try to keep it to 3 so I can win a Nobel Prize and share it equally. But if I need more, I need more. And if I can do it by myself, I'm going to do it by myself. If I want to start a company, I'd rather do it all by myself and keep all the equity. But I need to get funders. I need employees. I need to give people. And so that scale depends on the rewards. The rewards depend on energy availability and what I can do with it. I can keep going. This is the story of colonialization, by the way. This country, this tiny backwater of the Roman Empire that was late to the empire game, on the back of industrialization and cheap and available coal, built companies like the East India Company and built the largest empire the world had ever seen, right? And what you're really doing, it was very similar to the larger organisms deciding to eat the smaller organisms. It was the British Empire going after less energy dense or less cooperative societies and taking over and reaping them for their rewards.
So with this view of energy as kind of fueling the Industrial Revolution, GDP growth, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, it's interesting because your measure is quite pessimistic for now in a way, because what I see these days is there's quite a lot of celebration of, for example, renewable energy. The price of solar and wind and other renewables has been dropping quite precipitously recently. And actually, in the US, I think emissions have started to fall. I actually checked global emissions the other day, and I think they're falling. They're not falling by loads, probably not as much as we need them to, but they are falling. And that's I see people kind of celebrate these as like, this is the path to renewable energy. But through your framework, which is that you were saying, the amount of the amount of oil, 1 barrel of oil would get you. you're more pessimistic about what you call the energy ceiling, right? And you say
Right,
it's
right,
leading
right,
to
right.
decline. So, I mean, are you a pessimist, or am I
No,
misinterpreting
I
you?
mean, I'm fundamentally an optimist, but I am a concerned citizen, if you like, you know. Um, the I wrote this book because I do think we can escape this, but we need to take it seriously. I mean, the problem is like the energy sector is filled with people who are profiting based on their particular technology or whatever. And I would rather look at what the engineers have to say, who are just writing papers, and I did. Um, I mean, the first thing to say is there's still plenty of energy, just to be clear. There are only some technologies that seem to have the numbers to get us. So wind is not very good actually in terms of the returns on energy. Hydro is fantastic. If you have large, fast-flowing rivers, please
Hmm.
use them for energy. In terms of the returns, it's double digits. It's fantastic. Solar is falling quickly, but the problem is like how to store that. It's a little bit like the early life before the invention of mitochondria and ATP. When the sun was shining, you could do stuff, and when the sun wasn't shining, you couldn't, right? And if we can solve the solar
Hmm.
problem, then there's a fusion reactor in the sky that we ought to be making good use of. Nuclear has fantastic returns, but the regulatory environment means that the dollar cost, not the energy cost, the dollar cost is quite high.
Hmm.
But the Koreans are able to build them. The Chinese are able to build 228, I think, in current deployment. What I suggest is that if we ever crack fusion, because the rise in the energy ceiling, on the back of hydrogen, the most abundant material in the universe, we would be the first generation of a galactic civilization. Like what we would be capable of producing and doing, our quality of life would make our era look as dark as the Middle Ages, as primitive as that.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that a lot of our problems get resolved with wealth. With wealth comes lowering corruption, uh, people working together to achieve things that they can achieve by working together. The law of cooperation is almost tautological. Um, but we do have to kind of crack that. But there's a path. I mean, that's what part two of the book is all about. Like here are what I think are the barriers
Hmm.
to this, and here's how we can move forward. Now the problem I see is like so to me, um, ideologies like degrowth or sustainability in the sense of stagnation are a path to zero sumness and a return to a world where you win and I lose. Like if the pie is fixed and not growing, it means that if you get something, you've taken something that I can't get, and that's a very different psychology to we can both get something because the pie is growing. And these are, I mean, I first got into this, I first shifted careers because I was concerned that the kinds of things that I'd seen growing up are going to become more common because of climate change. And in my
Right.
view, I watched Al Gore's documentary in 2007, and I was like, Gore is right. And I started to read the IPCC reports. I read the Pentagon reports because I was like, the military ought to know what, they have to take this seriously for defense. And I was like, holy crap, like we're in trouble. But I was also like, you know what? I just don't think we're going to slow the economy to save the planet. We're just not. And if we do, amazing. I'm thrilled. But in the meantime, like, tell me, in a world where every country is trying to compete with every other country, and every company is trying to compete with every other company, and everyone wants more than their neighbors, these are like, if your theory of change requires you to fundamentally shift something that is kind of the law of evolution in a world of competition, a fundamental shift in human behavior. It's like communism or something, right? Like the entomologist E.O. Wilson said, "Great idea, wrong species." Communism works really well for ants, but
Hmm.
not so much for humans. So if your theory requires that, you're in trouble because those who do not go along with that are going to outcompete those that do. It's like when we were talking about the sex differences. You can try different traits and you should, but some of those are not going to be as good as others, and so you're going to get replaced. Religion is a great example of this, by the way, right? So like it's not an accident
Right.
that the major world religions say look after your families and perhaps have big ones, be kind to those that are the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, be kind to at least co-religionists. It's not that like any major world religion today has those beliefs because those beliefs help a religion grow. And in the same way, society is looking for different organizations and different traits and different rules that'll help that society grow. But if like let's say Europe says, hey, we're going to go with degrowth and we're going to double down on renewables and you ignore the physics of economics, you're in deep trouble. You're turning Europe into Africa in terms of its wealth. It's a pathway to poverty.
So, I mean, what kind of that did sound quite pessimistic to me. I mean, what kind of things do you think can be done to increase the energy ceiling and more broadly kind of tackle these challenges?
Yeah, so to my view, I would be very pessimistic if there were not technologies that either already existed or on the horizon, right? So we have a startup industry around fusion with a lot of like potential technologies, which if we crack it, amazing. But as they say, fusion is somewhere between next Monday and the next 30 years. People like Vaclav Smil suggest that at the earliest we're going to see fusion in 2050, right? That's the earliest we'll see viable fusion. In the meantime, nuclear, right? Like we forget like these large nuclear reactors. Like people had we're living in a hangover of the hippies or something, like we're living in this fears of an earlier generation that have long been resolved. If you were to judge cars based on 1950s cars, or you were to judge airplanes based on 1950s airplanes, you would never fly or drive. But we have massive advancements in safety. We have ways of dealing with the waste, which is actually not that big of a problem. We also have small modular reactors the size of a couple of football fields, or even micro reactors the size of a large car. Right? We use these technologies all the time in what's powering an aircraft carrier or a submarine. Right? These are used in the military sector already. We have these technologies at our disposal. So I see the primary barrier not as technological or even as energy per se, except that the ceiling is coming down on us. I see the barrier as social, fundamentally. Our ability to work
Hmm.
together to survive governance under conditions of decreased wealth, so poverty, which makes it difficult to get along with one another, to survive under conditions of mass migration, where you have people fleeing very difficult circumstances at Europe's doorstep, at the United States doorsteps, and so on, where suddenly, what are you going to, when hospitals are hard to get into, and houses are hard to get a hold of, and jobs and schools are hard to get into, and you suddenly have a bunch more people. It's
Hmm.
like removing the kind of political element of migration. It's like multiplying your poorest sector, or your sector just immediately. Like think about the kind of strains that would put on governance and society. The whole thing falls apart, and if we can't think in the long-term horizon, we're in deep trouble. So how do we correct this? There's a whole bunch of things, right? One is recognizing that we actually do, getting people out of their zero sum mindset by showing them actually we do have growth available to us, moving away from these kinds of platforms that push us toward stagnation and degrowth, and more towards sustainably managed migration and sustainable growth, taking control of how to build a great society. Like building a harmonious, innovative, and fair society is not unlike building a harmonious, innovative, and fair organization, right? Your hiring practices matter, making sure that there are jobs for the people who come, right? And you're bringing in, for example, migrants to fill jobs that are needed, right? Rather than at random. You're bringing people in the numbers that you can grow in a sustainable manner. You're making sure that you're investing in housing and schooling so that there isn't that pressure that's being put on these resources, right? You are looking for the things that are causing people to come apart, to lose trust in one another, and to lose trust in our institutions. Because once that's lost, because of the way that we learn, not based on, like, I don't have access to know that it is really germs making me sick and not spirits. I don't have access to know that the world is a spheroid and not flat. And once we lose trust in those sources of information, we're screwed. The whole thing comes apart. We're no longer living in a common world. I know that sounds pessimistic, but it's,
I mean, I'm
as I said,
wondering.
like,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a, you always start off optimistic and then you end up pessimistic.
I guess that
But
makes me
I
a
was
realist.
just
I don't know.
wondering because you mentioned trust. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, realism is the right
Yeah.
stance, I think. But with trust, I mean, one it really stuck out to me. Sorry, the role of trust there because I think it's something that maybe has been eroding gradually, and we kind of underestimated it because I don't know, it's not GDP, so it's not easy to measure. It's not even unemployment, right? It's sort of trust. How do you? I mean, you can do surveys, but we don't have national statistics, and it's not clear that they would be very easy to manipulate directly, right? It's just like, but trust does seem to have been eroding, and I think there are various factors there. the disconnect between sort of elites and everyone else. Probably the internet and the way social media is structured and things. I mean, trust really does
Yeah.
seem to have been declining, and I think the basis of a shared reality, whether you can, the information you see, so much information that we see is just it's just like made up. So fake news, literal fake news, not the way it's used now, but actual fake news, right? And so I'm just wondering what you think of this. How we address this massive declining trust and cohesion.
Yeah. So I mean, some of it is our own fault, right? So, for example, as I
Mm.
say in the book, I'm going to tell you actually, like I know you might get mad at me for the conclusions, or it might be uncomfortable what I'm saying, but if you can't trust that scientists are speaking freely, you can't trust science. If governments treat their citizens with disrespect, by 1 minute saying, hey, actually, masks don't work because they want to preserve PPE supplies. Like, no, the average person can't even fit a PPE. Like, what are you talking about? And then the next minute say, actually, everybody's got to wear a mask, even a cloth mask. And then not say, actually, the cloth mask turns out not that effective. You should have been wearing the N95s that we told you, or the N99s we told you not to wear in the first place, right? Like, how
Mm.
like it's not a mystery why like people lose trust in institutions, right? And it's not a mystery then we start to lose trust in one another as a result of that, like other groups that are held together by this institutional based cooperation. And on top of that, as I explained in the book, the internet has created rapid cultural evolution and new tribes. So it's not whether the internet is polarizing us or bringing us together is an empirical question that depends on the specifics of the social media and information ecology. There's no generalizable answer to that. But what the internet is definitely doing is
Of course,
speeding
yeah.
up cultural evolution. So, look, when we were kids, there was lots of fake false beliefs. Like I thought genuinely, I ate my carrots because I thought carrots would let me see in the dark. That was fake news. That
Mm.
was fake news, right? But the thing is, on
Mm.
the internet, not only does fake news or misinformation spread, but also corrections. I again in the book I tell a story of one of my friends from engineering who said to me, so we used to use Substack, which is like a Q&A place for programmers, software engineers.
Yeah.
And he would say, how like when you put a question on Substack and nobody ever answers, um, uh, sorry, not Substack, Stack Overflow. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, Stack
so
Overflow.
you
Yeah,
put
yeah, yeah,
you,
yeah.
you put it on Stack, you put it on. I was like, that's not right. You put it on Stack Overflow, and nobody answers. He said, you know what you do? What I do is I write the question, and then what I do is I use a Puppet account to post the wrong answer, and then everybody jumps in. They're like, someone on the
Yeah.
internet is wrong. I have to correct this injustice, right? The
Yeah.
other thing that the internet does is it allows us to connect with one another. Do you watch Little Britain?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen Little Britain,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, Dafford Thomas. He's like, I'm the only gay in the village, right?
Mm.
Once upon a time, he would have been one of a handful of gay men in his village, right? Even among heterosexual couples, I think Steve Johnson, the geneticist, said the bicycle was a major advancement for human genetics because I didn't have to use only this dating pool. I could visit the cute girl, in the neighboring village. We could meet halfway. Our
Hmm.
worlds were once very small, but because of the internet, and so if you live in a small world, right, and you're into porcelain plates or something, you're not going to find anyone else into porcelain plates. But what the internet has taught us is no matter how obscure or weird our interests are, there are other people who share it, and you might even grow in that interest. So, I talk about like subreddits, right? Like, do you like carrying sand in your pocket, Kahal? Do you carry sand in your pocket for its many
Mm.
uses?
I've never
30,000
done
people
it,
on
no.
Reddit. 30,000 people on Reddit. Or that's not as popular as stapling bread to trees and taking photos, which is regularly posted.
I do know about that one. I did know about that one actually. Yeah, stapling bread to trees is a big
Right.
community, of course.
300,000 people, right? Like that's a bigger city than many cities in the UK, right? 300,000 people around the
Mm.
world. So that the internet is creating new tribes. Now, those are whimsical, but QAnon is not whimsical, right?
Mm.
It can be a force for good. So people with rare medical conditions can find one another and share best practices that a doctor who heard about this illness for 10 minutes in their class once upon a time is not going to be as well informed as people sharing the information across many doctors in a kind of collective brain. But there's political activists,
Hmm.
there's all kinds of new tribes, and our governance structures are not prepared for that world. The governance structures developed at a time of horse-drawn carriages, uh, you know, were not developed for this world. And so then I suggest other pathways out of it, such as startup cities, right? More devolution down to things we know how to do quite well, cities. Give power back to cities, let them grow, let them coordinate with one another, let them create new cities to try new things, among other things. All of this stuff is not like me just
Hmm.
cogitating and coming up with stuff. It all falls out of the theory, dual inheritance theory, or
Hmm.
theory of everyone. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. It's
yeah. Can I?
interesting you
Yeah, sorry.
mentioned startup cities because yeah, sorry, no, please carry on.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, what the conceit of the book, if you like, is that
Mm,
there are these moments that happen in science where you realize something that changes everything, right? For example, we used to think, that the Earth was the center of the star system, if you like, the everything, and it's obvious. It's so obvious that the
mm,
sun is moving from across the sky from me. So it's so obvious. The Ptolemaic
mm,
system is actually highly predictive. It's very predictive of where the planets are. You just need these corrections, these little epicycles. But once we put and when Copernicus came along and he said actually the sun is in the center and the Earth is going around, he was still wrong because he wanted circular orbits, which still required these little epicycles. And it was Kepler who finally said, the sun is in the center and we have elliptical orbits and we have a nice model of the universe and all of orbital mechanics and a lot of astronomy flows from there. Yeah. It was a key moment
mm,
where the world became more understandable. Newton is trying to turn lead into gold, not because Newton's an idiot, because he doesn't have a periodic table. And when Mendeleev realized, hey, there's a pattern to the way that these happen and discovers the periodic table, we move from alchemy to chemistry. That moment is happening right now in the human and social sciences, in that we have a realization humans are not the product of just genes and a lifetime of learning. We are smarter than that. We have this software, this cultural software that is evolving over time. And there's a bunch of models that are being built out and a bunch of evidence. But from that basic realization, it's the equivalent of the sun is in the center and there's elliptical orbits. Once you get that,
mm,
it opens up new possibilities. So the first half of the book is here's the theory of everyone. And it's a mistake that I made is using the term theory because I ivory tower. I forget that when people say theory, they mean like I have a hypothesis about something. But when a scientist says a theory, they're talking about
yeah,
a network of mathematical models that make falsifiable predictions. So a theory of everyone is dual
yeah,
inheritance
yeah.
theory. And then the second half of the book is like, just maybe you bought the first half, maybe you didn't, but take me at face value. If what I'm saying is correct, then here's what we need to do to become more innovative, to create harmonious multicultural societies, to
Hmm.
solve the problem of governance in the 21st century, improve our education system, bring back the Flynn effect, and drive us forward into a more prosperous future.
Hmm. Hmm. So I mean, let's talk about the C word a little bit because it does come up in your book, but I wouldn't say your book's about capitalism, right? So your unifying framework, as far as I can tell, for the drivers of changes, which we've just discussed, is about energy. But I think a lot of people would say, well, this was capitalism, for better or worse, right? You can look at the rise of fossil fuels and the use of energy, which is clearly real and important. No, I don't think anybody would deny that. But you know, people who are pro-capitalism would say, well, no, it was capitalism that was responsible for this rise in wealth, right? It was capitalism that was responsible for GDP expanding and everything. And then critics of capitalism, and maybe if it's Karl Marx, they're kind of the same person, but they'll say, but capitalism is also ailing now.
Yeah.
It's declining. We've got booms and busts. We've got sort of insecure work and all of these kinds of developments. And this is, all of the problems that we've discussed, right? And the problems that you're a realist about, half optimist, half pessimist. Could you not say that these are driven by, let's say, the institution, the system of capitalism, and energy is a part of that, but maybe not the driving force? I mean, what
Yeah.
would you say to that?
So a few things. So it is capitalism. It is absolutely capitalism, but capitalism in the context
Right.
of gains to be made by people working together in companies, for example. And you can see the history of this, right? So my collaborator and former advisor, Joe Henrik, has this book, The
Mm-hmm.
Weirdest People in the World, and a series of papers on the role
Yeah.
of the Catholic Church banning cousin marriage and a variety of other marriage practices in Europe that creates the modern nuclear family that we call a traditional family, but it's anything but. It's like when people are no longer marrying their cousins, you're down to more individualist mom, dad, kids, uncle, aunt, rather than your uncle is connected to you by many things and part of this big network of obligations. And that alongside that are the rise of the guilds, right? Where so most of the world, they do have kind of corporations, but they're family corporations, right? You work with in the family
Yeah.
trade and you can grow that. But there's a space under this new European model for guilds where people can freely confer their labor based on their own interests and their own skill sets. There's this famous paper by Avner Greif on the Maghrebi traders, the Jewish traders in the Mediterranean. And again, it's a competition between those engaging in a family network of trade and the trust that they were able to maintain across these networks from Palestine, all the way to Spain, based on reputation and sharing of reputation. Again, these are the basics of capitalism, but from a theoretical perspective, it's because they are the basis of what's called cultural group selection. Companies competing with one another, where individuals are freely moving between them and in the pursuit of more efficiency. You make money under capitalism when you provide value to people. And that is it's a little bit like Churchill, he said, democracy is a terrible system, except all the others.
Mm.
It's better than all the others. Capitalism is a terrible system, except for all the others. Now, my issue is actually, or what I'm trying to do in terms of capitalism, is create a more efficient capitalism, a fairer capitalism. So there are barriers to capitalism, or there are inefficiencies in capitalism that create problems, especially when the goods are limited, if you like. Especially when the goods are limited, but in any case, the accumulation. So like Thomas Piketty's point, right, which is that under conditions of
Hmm.
growth, inequality decreases because there's opportunities to get something new in that space of the possible, right? In a similar fashion, um, one of the barriers is inherited wealth, or the accumulation of inherited wealth, which is not so much of an issue if there's economic growth because you can get wealth elsewhere. But it is an issue when things are constrained because there's nowhere to go. There's nothing how to access that. Now, how to solve that is a difficult problem. There's issues of fairness, right? Um, Inheritance taxes. What do we do? Like, does it disincentivize people from working in later life? Is that a fair way to do things? So one of the small changes that I suggest that could get us out of this is land value taxes. So compared to every other thing that one can own, the one thing that we did not create was the land. And taxing, so art, companies, whatever, all of that, we created, patents even,
Mm.
we did not create the land, and there's a limited amount of it. And so if you create a land value tax where you tax the value of the land, no, not what's on it, but the value of the land. So you're taxing oil and natural gas and mineral deposits. You can pretty much pay for all the other, like, why do we tax income and distort people's willingness to work? Why do we tax sales or capital gains? Get rid of all of that and just tax the land, adjust it slightly. It'll create a more efficient system and it'll prevent that accumulation of wealth. An example I use in the book is, by the way, imagine if debt were inherited in the same way that wealth were inherited. You would have people who,
Mm.
because of whatever their ancestors did, that would be impossible. No matter what they did, they could never get out of that. We have the opposite problem where the wealth is accumulated often through land, but not always. I think it's actually fine if it's not through land, but often through land where it's impossible to lose that. And what money really is a voting share on how we allocate our energy budget toward goods and services. And a fairer system is one in which people have every generation a fairly even playing field, as close as we can get to that, where
Hmm.
the best of every generation are not limited by the happenstance of their birth, and they're able to accumulate wealth and then make bigger bets based on that wealth that push us forward as a species. So my issue is that capitalism is broken not because it's of its system, but because it is not efficient enough. That there are
Mm.
these actual barriers to a more efficient version of capitalism, which has all the hallmarks of a good system otherwise.
The Georgists are already celebrating in chat. They're a very big presence on the internet. I think there's everyone's really into the land value tax. I
Oh,
mean, it's
good.
interesting what you say about inheritance because I'm
Yeah.
kind of struggling. I think there's a bit of a delay, by the way. Something happened in the middle of the call. I think it was when you almost cut out, and now My lips are unsynced on stream. I think there's a delay between me and you. So anyway, uh, but
Yeah.
um, but what was I going to say? So with inheritance, I'm kind of, I think I agree with you because I'm kind of struggling to imagine large inheritances being that prevalent without land and real estate and things. Because if you think about all the dynasties, right, and I think you discussed that paper about, is it about surnames in the UK? And in the UK, I mean, as far as rich countries go and as far as maybe countries go in general, we have like the biggest inherited land dynasty that you can imagine. And if it wasn't possible to do that, then you can see inheritance probably wouldn't disappear, but it would become a much smaller source of inequality. I mean, do you have any idea of the calculations on that, or?
On specifically dynasties, the problem is it's very difficult to. The reason we've used things like surnames is that it's hard to track this wealth. People have an incentive uh, to not make it obvious. And by the way, that's another advantage of compared to like so. With problem with inheritance taxes is wealth can flee, but what can't flee is the land. So if you tax the land, it doesn't
Mm,
matter who owns it. And it doesn't matter your
mm,
fancy subsidiary, trust corporation. It doesn't matter. Somebody's paying for it, right? And I think that is, that there's massive incentives to not talk about this, and to not let
mm,
it enter the Overton window of political discussion, because I think if people realized what this represented, um, it would create a fairer world, but it would also upset the current world order. I mean, I talk about we know a few anecdotes. So in Florence, for example, I think the same five surnames from the Middle Ages are still the same five wealthiest people, families. Um,
wow.
in the UK, it's well tracked. Even in China, by the way, after a revolution that presumably got rid of the elite, those elite surnames are still overrepresented in the halls of power. Uh,
I mean, that is a striking finding. I have to comment there. I remember reading
yeah,
that and I was like, oh, wow. Because I can't,
yeah,
if you're thinking about something that upends the existing order more than Maoism, I don't really know what that would be, right?
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah,
you're talking about an absolute revolution in taking away all of the landlord's power, and yet two
yeah,
generations later, you've still got this inheritance, whether it's cultural. I think you talk about social connections, don't you,
yeah. There's other
in the
factors. It
book,
could be
right? And
genetics, could be anything.
the
Yeah,
networks. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's just
Yeah,
wild, that
absolutely,
finding to
absolutely.
me.
I mean, like remember I took the gloves off, right? I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble at some point, but
Mm,
I talk about land in this country, right? When Gerald Grosvenor died of the Grosvenor estate and handed his fortune over to Hugh Grosvenor, his son, 25 years old at the time, Gerald was once asked, like, what is the secret to your business success? And then he said, have an ancestor who is friends with William the Conqueror. And he was talking about Gilbert le Grosvenor, who came over from France with William the Conqueror in 1066, and then was given this land, which the family then held on to for 1,000 years. And London is still like that, right? I never heard of
mm,
leasehold until I came to this country. I'm like, what do you
yeah,
mean? What do you mean I don't own it? Like, you tell me 99 years, I give it back, which is a time horizon that to you and I was like, okay, 99 years, whatever. But like to people who've owned this for generations, that's a way to preserve it, right? It's not the most
yeah,
efficient use, and that land gives you voting power. It allows you to store your wealth in a more secure way. Because otherwise, right, if you store your wealth in companies, in shares, in patents, or whatever, you have to continue innovating to hold on to that wealth. You know, you have to continue innovating, and under land value taxes, you have to continue developing in order to hold on to that wealth. So it's not that you can't own land. I mean, it sounds like you got a bunch of Georgists who can talk about this very well, but like it's not that you don't own the land, it's that you pay for the right to control that
yeah,
land. You didn't make
yeah.
it. Yeah.
I suppose one question. So returning to capitalism, because I think Georgism is one of the best economic philosophies or schools or whatever you want to call it in terms of, I think, how everybody seems to agree that it's good. It seems to be good kind of morally. It seems to be good economically in terms of efficiency. I think it would increase the number of homes built, for instance, right? I think it would be good for like GDP as well as being good for kind of people and social outcomes and being probably good for things like even racial inequality, right? Because more landowners tend
Yeah,
to be
that's right.
white in a lot of countries, right?
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but I just wonder because the nub of Georgism is as you said, we didn't create the land. Now I wonder, what about something like just a very passive owner of capital? Because for me, when I think about land, okay, land is distinct. They're not exactly the same. I'm not going to argue they're exactly the same. But if you're a passive owner of capital and you're accruing quite a lot of wealth, well, you have wealth, sorry, that's accruing income, whether it's from the stock market or whatever, is that not very, very similar to land? And if so, should something be done about that as well?
I struggle to come up with as strong a moral or efficiency case for that kind of capital, and part of the reason as well is that um, it's less passive, if you like, right? Like if you companies go bust all the time, you have to continue to reallocate your portfolio, your stock portfolio, for example. There isn't something quite like just rent seeking on literal rent, what we would in the vernacular call rent.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I can imagine a scenario where you are the monopoly and then you use that power to suppress other groups. So we have antitrust legislation to kind of handle that edge case. But otherwise, especially under conditions where wealth is now, I have a whole section about, I guess I didn't talk about the Cantillon effect, but there's a whole bunch of things around the fact that we produce more money, creating inflation, and that inflation puts us on a treadmill that requires a continual reallocation of your wealth in order to at least be above inflation, and that actually is a driver of efficiency because you have to keep reallocating. So even if you're paying someone to do it, they're extracting value from that, if you like, in order to do it. So I mean, and it's hard to know how to handle that as well, by the way, right? Like, so if you don't sell your shares, it's hard to know how you're supposed to tax that. Like, should I be like, should Tesla not be, how do I say this? Tesla or Microsoft or whatever. How do I handle the fact until Gates or Musk sells their shares? What am I supposed to do? Take that away from them? Who should it go to? Who's going to run the company? Right? And when they die,
Hmm.
maybe it's a problem. Like one of the things about money is it's a vote, and you get more votes if you do very well. Like you create more efficiency for other people. But you can also lose money, right? Like Musk has done with Twitter, now X. You can
Yeah.
lose money in that allocation as well. And when it gets handed over to the next person, right? If they don't have clear stores of value like land, they are going to make, if they're good, they're going to make good decisions and fine. But if they're not, they're going to get outcompeted by newcomers. The incumbents don't always win in these other spheres. So that's why I guess I'm less concerned. So yeah, there's probably some effect and some unfairness, and maybe we still need some inheritance taxes, but I would rather wipe out the other taxes and replace them with land value taxes. 6% should pay for the whole thing. Um, and by the way, that should include
Mm.
like oil and natural oil and resources because that's where a lot of that value is going to come from.
Right.
Um,
That 6%, yeah, I remember that from the book. So you said 6% land value tax would be able to replace all the taxes in the USA. Is
yeah,
that
so
right?
no, so in the US it should at least it's hard these numbers, but it should at least pay for things like the
Of
entire
course.
military budget, which is enormous, and Medicare and Medicaid.
Mm.
And in this country, I
Yeah.
suspect it would go a lot further because so much of the value is held in land in Australia too.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Well, I am aware that you have a meeting in 2 minutes, right? So is that
Correct.
right?
Yeah, yeah. It is
So
correct. Yeah.
I'll have to say goodbye because I could have carried on there, but yeah, I really enjoyed speaking to you, and thanks. I'll let you get to your meeting, but again,
Thank you, Carl.
thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Cahal. This is one of the conversations where
Yes.
we really got into the deep controversial stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
I
we
really
really did.
appreciate it. Viva la revolution.